We're starting with animal-based tortures because they reveal something crucial about medieval psychology: the understanding that psychological horror amplifies physical pain. Let's begin with rats. Rat torture appears in medieval Dutch records, ancient Chinese documents, and Roman accounts spanning 2,000 years. The mechanism is deceptively simple, but the execution reveals a sophisticated understanding of animal behavior. Victims were strapped to tables, unable to move. A cage containing several rats was placed on their torso, sometimes their face, sometimes their groin, depending on the crime. Then heat was applied to the cage's exterior using hot coals or torches. Here's the biomechanics. Rats can survive temperatures up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit comfortably, but beyond that, they panic. Trapped with nowhere to go, they do what rodents do naturally: they burrow. The human abdomen provides the path of least resistance. Historical accounts from the Dutch Revolt describe executioners making initial incisions to facilitate the process, essentially creating starting points. The rats, driven by heat-induced frenzy, would gnaw through skin, fat, and eventually muscle. Death didn't come quickly. Infection was the typical killer, but that took days. More immediately, victims experienced the psychological torment of feeling the animals moving inside their bodies, the sensation of teeth against internal organs, and the wet sounds of feeding. Guards reported prisoners would last hours before unconsciousness, shaking off rats repeatedly until exhaustion made resistance impossible. When they woke, they'd discover hundreds of bites, flesh missing in chunks. The Tower of London had a variation called the Rat Dungeon. Cells below Thames waterline flooded when tides rose, forcing rats from riverside burrows into the dungeon. Prisoners were chained in darkness as water brought waves of hungry rodents. The innovation wasn't in the torture itself, it was in the automation. No executioner needed, just rising water and hungry animals. During the Dutch Revolt of 1566-1648, rebel leader Diederik Sonoy reportedly used rat torture extensively for extracting confessions. The method was so effective that prisoners would confess before the rats even began burrowing, the anticipation alone breaking their resistance. Some historians suggest this psychological element was the true purpose. The threat was often more valuable than the execution. Ancient Rome had its own variant. Emperor Nero, fond of theatrical cruelty, would place rats or other small animals in sealed pots with openings positioned against prisoners' abdomens. Heat applied to the pot would drive the animals to escape through the only available route, into the human body. Roman sources describe this happening to Christians during persecutions, though the exact frequency remains debated. Now consider the rack. You've seen movie versions, but the historical reality was far more calculated. The device originated in ancient Greece around 400 BC, but medieval Europeans perfected it into a surgical instrument of precision. It wasn't a simple stretching machine, it was a calibrated system designed to produce maximum pain while extracting confessions. The wooden frame featured rollers at both ends, connected to ratchet mechanisms. Victims were laid on their backs, wrists and ankles bound to separate rollers. Then the turning began. Each quarter turn increased tension by precisely measured increments. Executioners were trained to recognize the sequence of joint failure. Fingers first, then wrists, elbows, and shoulders. The lower body followed the same progression: toes, ankles, knees, hips. What made it effective wasn't the dislocation itself, it was the cartilage and ligaments that tore slowly. Unlike bone breaking, which happens in an instant, soft tissue failure is progressive. Victims could feel each microscopic tear as it happened, a crescendo of pain building over minutes or hours. Some racks incorporated spiked rollers in the middle, so as victims stretched, their backs would press into metal points, creating additional wounds that would worsen with each turn. Guy Fawkes experienced this in 1605 after the gunpowder plot failed. Records indicate he couldn't sign his confession. His signature appeared as barely legible scratches because his hands no longer functioned. He'd been stretched until his shoulder joints separated, rendering his arms useless. When finally executed, he had to be carried to the scaffold. The rack's use extended beyond England. French, Spanish, and German variants existed, each with local modifications. The Spanish version sometimes included a heated metal plate, beneath the victim's back, adding burning to stretching. German models featured adjustable tension settings, allowing torturers to maintain specific pressure levels for extended periods. Historical records from the Tower of London show the rack was used. Sparingly, its presence was often sufficient. Simply showing a prisoner the device and explaining its function would elicit confessions. When actually employed, sessions rarely lasted more than an hour. The human body has limits, and executioners knew exceeding them meant losing the prisoner before extracting useful information. The breaking wheel took stretching's opposite approach: compression and crushing. Medieval Europe used it from the 14th through the 19th centuries. The condemned was laid on the ground, limbs splayed, and tied to a large wagon wheel. Executioners used iron bars or wooden clubs to methodically shatter every major bone, starting with fingers and toes, moving to forearms and shins, then upper arms and thighs. The sentence specified exact numbers: 40 blows for theft, 60 for murder, 80 for treason. Here's the medical reality: bones don't break cleanly, like in movies. When a blunt object strikes a long bone with sufficient force, it creates a stellate fracture. The bone shatters into multiple fragments with sharp edges. Those fragments cut the surrounding muscle, sever blood vessels, and damage nerves. Each strike would cause the body to jerk involuntarily, driving bone shards deeper into tissue. The pain didn't come from just the impact itself, but from the aftermath. Jagged bone pieces grinding against each other with every breath, every heartbeat. After the breaking, victims were woven through the wheel's spokes, possibly because broken limbs could bend in unnatural ways. The wheel was mounted on a pole and displayed publicly. Some died within hours from shock or internal bleeding. Others survived days, bones grinding, unable to move, exposed to the sun and insects. In Germany, they'd sometimes place the wheel over a fire for added suffering. The Catherine wheel, as it was known, had variations across Europe. In France, the wheel was horizontal and the victim was placed on top, limbs tied to spokes radiating outward. The executioner would strike from above. In Germanic regions, the wheel was vertical, the victim bound to its face, and it would be rotated between strikes. Each culture added its own refinements to maximize either suffering or public spectacle, depending on the crime. Records from 14th century France describe a murderer who survived 3 days on the wheel before finally expiring. Crowds would gather daily to witness his continued suffering, with vendors selling food and drink to spectators. Wheel had become entertainment, a public festival of agony that demonstrated the state's absolute power over life and death. Spanish boots evolved from Scottish rawhide versions into sophisticated crushing devices. The most effective design used wooden planks fastened around the leg from ankle to knee, with spaces between planks. Wooden wedges were hammered into these spaces using mallets. Each strike drove the wedges deeper, compressing the leg between boards. The body contains 206 bones. The lower leg alone has the tibia and fibula, plus 26 bones in the foot. Spanish boots could fracture all of them, but fractures weren't the primary torture. It was nerve compression. The leg contains 3 major nerves: tibial, peroneal, and sural. When crushed, these nerves fire pain signals continuously. Unlike cuts or burns, crushed nerves create deep, radiating agony that feels like electricity running through the entire leg. Metal versions added interior spikes. As screws tightened, spikes penetrated flesh while crushing bones. Victims would lose consciousness from pain, be revived with cold water, and the crushing would continue. The 18th century records describe prisoners losing use of legs permanently, nerve damage so severe that they would never walk normally again. Scotland used a rawhide variant, where wet leather was wrapped tightly around the leg, then placed near a fire. As the leather dried, it contracted with immense force, crushing the leg without any active effort from the torturer. This passive torture was considered particularly insidious. The torturer could simply walk away and let physics do the work. The scavenger's daughter did the opposite of the rack. It compressed instead of stretched. Invented by Sir William Skevington in Tudor England, it forced victims into a crouched position with knees pulled to the chest and the head forced down. The A-frame design locked all major joints in flexed positions. What makes forced compression uniquely torturous is that it doesn't just cause pain, it prevents breathing. The ribcage can't expand properly. Each breath becomes a struggle, taking maximum effort effort for minimum air intake. Carbon dioxide builds up in the blood, creating a sensation of drowning while fully conscious and dry. Catholic priest Luke Kirby endured this in 1580. He wrote that while bound, he felt loose and unbound toward God, a remarkable statement given the physical reality. The device prevented any movement whatsoever. Muscles would cramp from being locked in contraction. Blood flow to the extremities would slow, creating numbness, followed by sharp tingling as circulation struggled. Some versions incorporated spikes that made any movement, even breathing, cut into flesh. The compression also affected internal organs. The stomach and intestines would be forced upward against the diaphragm. The heart would struggle to pump against the external pressure. After even 30 minutes in this position, victims would experience muscle death in compressed areas, tissue literally dying from lack of blood flow. Release brought its own agony as circulation returned, creating intense burning sensations throughout the body. Thumb screws seem almost quaint compared to the rack or wheel, but their portability made them insidious. The basic design, two metal pieces with a screw mechanism, creating a vise for thumbs or fingers. Turn the screw, crush the digit. Simple, effective, portable enough for traveling torturers. The hand contains 27 bones, 14 in fingers alone. Each finger has 3 bones, except the thumb, which has 2. Thumb screws could fracture them individually, but the real pain came from the 17,000 touch receptors in each hand. These receptors exist to detect pressure, texture, and temperature. Under extreme pressure, they don't shut off. They scream. Medieval records show thumb screws used in asylums like Bedlam for uncooperative patients. Confessions extracted this way were legally admissible in many jurisdictions. The device's genius was precision. Unlike larger torture devices that might accidentally kill, thumb screws could be calibrated for maximum pain with minimal permanent damage, unless, of course, the torturer wanted permanent damage, in which case the crushed bones and severed tendons would ensure the victim never used that hand properly again. Variations existed for toes. The same principle applied to feet. Some elaborate versions had multiple screws, allowing simultaneous compression of all fingers on one hand. The most sophisticated models included ratcheting mechanisms that prevented accidental loosening, maintaining constant pressure even when the torturer stepped away. The Spanish donkey deserves special mention for its brutal simplicity. A sharp-angled wooden wedge, sometimes with nails embedded in the ridge, functioned as a torture device. Victims were forced to straddle it, sitting on the sharp edge with weights attached to their feet to increase pressure. The design exploited anatomy. The perineum, the area between the genitals and anus, contains numerous nerve clusters but minimal protective tissue. When body weight, plus added weights, pressed down on this area via a sharp wooden edge, the pain was immediate and intense. Prolonged sitting would cause the ridge to cut into flesh, potentially splitting the victim partially in two if the weights were heavy enough. Used during the Spanish Inquisition and later in the American Civil War for punishing Confederate prisoners, the donkey could render victims unable to walk. The damage wasn't immediately fatal, but caused permanent disability. Some victims passed out from pain within minutes. Others endured hours, depending on the sentence. Molten gold down the throat sounds like mythology, but documented cases exist. In 1599, Spanish governor Antonio de Ursua attempted to levy taxes on Jivaro Indians in Ecuador. They captured him, tied him down, and poured molten gold into his mouth. Roman records describe Manius Aquilius dying the same way in 89 BC. The physics are straightforward but horrifying. Gold melts at 1948 degrees Fahrenheit. Human tissue burns at 130 degrees. The moment molten gold touched lips, tongue, and throat, it would cause third-degree burns instantly. The liquid metal would flow down the esophagus, burning through mucous membranes, scorching the stomach lining. Steam from moisture in tissues would create pressure, potentially rupturing organs. If the gold solidified in the throat, which it would as it cooled, the victim would asphyxiate while simultaneously burning from the inside. Death likely came from shock within minutes, but those minutes would feel eternal. The symbolism mattered too. Greed was punished with the object of desire. The irony wasn't lost on witnesses. Some historians question whether molten gold was actually used, suggesting the stories might be propaganda. Gold's value made wasting it on executions questionable. However, multiple independent sources across different cultures describe the practice, suggesting it occurred at least occasionally, perhaps reserved for particularly hated enemies where the symbolic value outweighed the material cost. Boiling to death had similar thermal dynamics but prolonged them. In 1531, Richard Rose, cook to the Bishop of Rochester, was accused of poisoning food. King Henry VIII, paranoid about poison, made boiling alive the punishment specifically for poisoners. Rose was lowered into boiling water at London's Smithfield. Accounts describe the process taking 2 hours. He was immersed 3 times, pulled out between immersions. Water at 212 degrees Fahrenheit causes instant pain as nerve endings detect the heat. But unlike fire, which burns away nerves relatively quickly, boiling water maintains contact with the entire body surface. Skin would blister and slough off. Muscle tissue would cook, proteins denaturing. Internal organs would begin to fail as core body temperature rose past sustainable levels. The cruelty was in the repetition. Brief reprieves between immersions allowed sensation to return, making each subsequent immersion feel worse than the last. Witnesses reported Rose roared mighty loud. Some women in the crowd vomited. Even in an era accustomed to public executions, this crossed a line. Henry VIII's statute making boiling the punishment for poisoners lasted only until 1547, when his son, Edward VI, repealed it. The practice was deemed too cruel, even by 16th century standards, which tells you something about its severity. Burning at the stake focused heat differently. Victims were tied to wooden posts, surrounded by kindling and wood. The fire was lit at their feet, flames climbing slowly upward. Joan of Arc died this way in 1431, convicted of heresy. The body's response to fire is complex. Initially, nerve endings overwhelm the brain with pain signals, but prolonged exposure actually damages the nerves themselves, creating patches of numbness amid the burning. Victims often passed out from smoke inhalation before flames reached vital organs, a mercy, relatively speaking. But if the wind direction was wrong or the wood was damp, burning could take much longer, keeping victims conscious longer. Biblical roots influenced this punishment. Fire was seen as purifying, burning away sin along with flesh. The public spectacle served as religious theater, a demonstration of the church's power over heresy. Crowds numbered in thousands for major executions. Executioners sometimes showed mercy by strangling victims before flames reached them, or by hanging gunpowder around their necks to cause quick death when ignited. But this mercy was unofficial and depended entirely on the executioner's compassion, or whether they'd been bribed by the victim's family. The aftermath of the burning was also significant. Authorities would often grind the ashes and scatter them to prevent relics from being collected. Joan of Arc's remains were thrown in the Seine for exactly this reason, to prevent her becoming a martyr with physical evidence of her existence. Now we move to permanent mutilations, punishments designed not to kill, but to mark. Yubitsume, Japanese finger removal, was a yakuza ritual, not a state punishment. Members who offended superiors would amputate their own little finger's tip at the first joint, presenting it as an apology. Repeat offenses meant more joints, more fingers. The practice exploited sword grip mechanics. Traditional Japanese sword fighting requires all fingers working together, the little finger providing crucial stability. Remove it, and you can't grip a sword properly. You're literally weakened, making the mutilation both symbolic and practical. It marked you permanently as someone who'd failed, visible to everyone. The ritual involved placing the finger on a flat surface and using a sharp blade to sever it cleanly at the joint. The severed portion would be wrapped in cloth and presented to the offended party. Modern yakuza sometimes skip the actual cutting and present artificial fingers, but traditionally, the act was genuine and irreversible. Egyptian hand amputations for tomb robbery served similar marking purposes. Thieves caught stealing from burial sites, considered sacred, had their right hands severed. Archaeological evidence from Nile sites includes piles of severed hands, apparently kept as trophies or evidence. The hand contains an intricate network of 29 major arteries, 48 named nerves, and 123 named ligaments. Severing it requires cutting through all of those. Done without medical care, the infection was almost guaranteed. Even if the infection didn't kill, the victim faced life as a marked criminal, unable to work most jobs, publicly identified as a thief forever. Ancient Egyptian records describe the process. The hand would be placed on a stone block. A sharp sharp axe or blade would sever it at the wrist in one stroke. The stump would be cauterized with hot metal to prevent immediate death from blood loss. The severed hand would be counted as evidence of the execution's completion, hence the piles of hands archaeologists have discovered. Nature magazine published findings in 2023 describing a mass grave in Egypt containing hands severed at the wrist, all right hands, dated to approximately 1640–1530 BC. The uniformity suggests systematic amputation as punishment, supporting historical accounts of this practice. Nose removal combined disfigurement with social exile. In ancient Egypt's Rhinocolura prison city, thieves had noses cut off before banishment. The logic: if they escaped and returned, the missing nose instantly identified them. The nose contains cartilage, not bone, making it relatively easy to remove with a sharp blade. But it's also one of the most visible facial features. Without it, speech changes, nasal sounds become impossible, breathing becomes difficult, and the cosmetic damage was permanent and impossible to hide. Anglo-Saxon England used this for adultery. A girl discovered in an affair might have her nose and lips removed. The punishment combined physical pain with social destruction. She'd never be considered attractive again, marking her as unchaste permanently. The phrase, "cut off your nose to spite your face," may have originated from these punishments, though that etymology is disputed. What's certain is that nose removal was widespread across cultures as a non-lethal but permanent marking punishment. Flaying, removing skin while alive, appeared across cultures from medieval Europe to ancient Assyria. The skin is the body's largest organ, covering about 20 square feet on an average adult and weighing roughly 8 pounds. It's also packed with pain receptors, about 1,000 nerve endings per square inch. The process involved making incisions, typically starting at the extremities, then slowly peeling skin away from underlying muscle and fat. Some executioners would boil victims first to loosen the skin, making removal easier. Others used sharp knives, working methodically to keep the skin in one piece. Here's the medical horror: you can survive initial flaying. Shock might set in, but you'd remain conscious. The exposed flesh would be extraordinarily sensitive. Even air movement would cause intense pain. Infection would begin immediately as bacteria colonized the raw tissue. Death typically came from sepsis or blood loss within hours or days, but those hours would be unimaginable agony. Chinese Emperor Hongwu reportedly flayed 5,000 women in the 14th century, though this number is likely exaggerated. Richard the Lionheart's killer was flayed in medieval England. The practice existed because it worked, as both torture for confession and ultimate punishment. Assyrian records describe flaying as punishment for rebels. The removed skin would sometimes be displayed on city walls as a warning to others. In some cases, the skin would be tanned and preserved like leather, creating a permanent trophy of the execution. Moving to isolation torture, immurement, being walled up alive, combined isolation with slow death. Medieval castles had spaces specifically designed for this, small chambers behind walls where victims would be sealed with only a small opening for minimal food and water, or sometimes no opening at all. Warwick Castle's oubliette, discovered during the 1900s renovations, contained dozens of skeletons. The word oubliette comes from the French oublier, to forget. That was the point. Throw someone in, seal it up, forget about them. Without food or water, death comes in days. The human body can survive roughly 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, but the psychological torture of being in complete darkness, unable to move, hearing the world continue outside while you're entombed alive, that's arguably worse than physical pain. Some victims were kept barely alive for years, given just enough sustenance to prevent death, maximizing suffering duration. Leap Castle in Ireland had a similar space, an 8-foot drop into a chamber filled with bones when discovered. Workers needed multiple cartloads to clear the skeletons. The number of victims was never determined. The oubliette at Warwick was particularly cruel. It was positioned so that screams couldn't be heard outside. The only sound would be your own voice echoing back, water dripping, and eventually rats arriving to investigate. The floor was often covered in previous victims' remains, meaning you'd be lying in death while waiting for your own. Some oubliettes were designed with false hope. A small opening at the top would allow light, making escape seem theoretically possible. Victims would exhaust themselves trying to climb sheer walls, repeatedly failing, the hope itself becoming torture. Keel hauling happened at sea, the Navy's answer to the rack. The victim was tied to ropes and dragged underneath the ship from one side to the other, passing under the keel, the bottommost part of the hull. Here's what made it devastating. Ship hulls were covered in barnacles. These aren't just rough, they're razor-sharp crustaceans with edges like broken glass. Being dragged across them would shred skin like a cheese grater. The pressure would crush the victim against the hull, while barnacles sliced open flesh from head to toe. Add the drowning factor. Victims had to hold their breath while being hauled underwater. If they gasped from pain, they'd inhale seawater, filling their lungs. Some would have necks or backs broken from impact with the keel. Others would simply drown partway through. Dutch naval records from the 17th century described this as standard punishment for serious infractions. It wasn't meant to be lethal. Technically, it was just punishment, not execution. But death rates were high. Survivors would be covered in cuts, and infections were inevitable. The 1780 Universal Dictionary of the Marine noted they'd give victims sufficient intervals to recover, remarkably humane by contemporary standards. The last documented keel hauling occurred in 1882, when 2 Egyptian sailors were punished for looting and murder. Even then, it was considered barbaric. Most navies had abandoned the practice by the mid-19th century. Scaphism, the Persian boats method, might be history's most elaborate execution. The victim was force-fed milk and honey, then stripped naked and placed between 2 boats or hollowed logs, leaving only head, hands, and feet exposed. More milk and honey were smeared on exposed skin. Then they were set afloat on a stagnant pond. The milk and honey mixture caused severe diarrhea. The victim would defecate and vomit repeatedly, trapped in their own waste. The honey attracted insects, flies, wasps, bees, and ants. These would feast on the sweet coating and the victim's flesh. Some would enter the exposed orifices, burrowing into ears, nose, mouth, and other openings. Greek historian Plutarch described Persian soldier Mithridates enduring this for 17 days in 401 BC. By the end, his flesh was rotting away in his own filth and devoured by worms. Insects laid eggs in the wounds. Larvae hatched and fed on living tissue. The victim would be fully conscious for much of this, unable to move, unable to escape, slowly being eaten alive by thousands of tiny mouths. Byzantine chronicler Zonaras wrote, "Flies, wasps, and bees, attracted by the sweetness, settle on his face, and all such parts of him as project outside the boats, and miserably torment and sting the wretched man. Moreover, his belly, distended as it is with milk and honey, throws off liquid excrements, and these putrefying breed swarms of worms, intestinal and of all sorts." Whether this actually happened as described, or was Greek propaganda against the Persians, remains debated. No Persian sources confirm it, but the fact that multiple Greek sources describe it in detail suggests at least the concept existed and may have been practiced even if rarely. Impalement, famously associated with Vlad the Impaler, was more widespread than one man's legacy suggests. The method, a sharpened wooden stake is inserted into the body, typically through the anus or vagina, and then the victim is raised upright, gravity slowly driving the stake deeper through the torso. The stake was sometimes blunted intentionally to avoid puncturing vital organs too quickly. It would follow the path of least resistance, typically along the spine, avoiding the heart and major blood vessels. This meant victims could survive for hours or days as the stake slowly penetrated upward through their bodies, eventually emerging through the shoulder, neck, or even mouth. Vlad reportedly impaled 20,000 people during his reign in the 15th century, displaying them along roads as warnings. The psychological impact was immense. Imagine traveling and seeing forests of impaled corpses. But impalement existed earlier. Babylonian king Hammurabi's code mentioned it in the 18th century BC. It appeared in ancient Rome, medieval Europe, and continued into the 19th century during the Armenian genocide. The cruelty was in the gradual nature. Unlike hanging or beheading, impalement gave victims time to contemplate their fate, feel every inch of penetration, and suffer prolonged agony before death. The stake's path through the body would miss major organs if done skillfully, extending survival time dramatically. Some accounts describe victims being given food and water while impaled to prolong their suffering further. The stake would be positioned so that sitting or standing would increase penetration, forcing victims to choose between exhaustion and increased pain. Hanged, drawn, and quartered, combined multiple tortures into one spectacle. Reserved for high treason in medieval England, it proceeded in stages. First, drawing. The condemned were dragged through the streets behind a horse, often on a wooden hurdle to prevent death from head injuries before the main event. Second, hanging, but only until near death, not to completion. The victim would be cut down while still conscious. Third, the real horror, disembowelment while alive. Executioners would cut open the abdomen and pull out intestines, often burning them in front of the victim. They'd castrate male victims, removing their genitalia. Fourth, beheading, finally ending the suffering. Fifth, quartering, chopping the corpse into 4 pieces, each sent to different locations as warning displays. William Wallace endured this in 1305. Edward de Spartheld faced it in 1803, though by then they'd removed the disembowelment part. Just drawing and beheading remained. Guy Fawkes was supposed to suffer the full version in 1606, but his rope broke his neck during hanging, sparing him the worst parts. The medical reality: you can survive having your intestines removed for several minutes. The gut contains extensive nerve networks. Pulling them out while alive would create indescribable pain. Blood loss would eventually cause death, but not immediately. Victims would watch their own organs removed and burned, conscious and aware. The practice was finally fully abolished in England in 1870, though the last full execution happened decades earlier. The punishment's excessive cruelty eventually became politically untenable, even for traitors. Crushing by elephants happened in ancient India and Asia into the 19th century. Trained elephants would slowly crush victims, starting with limbs, then torso, then finally the head. Some rulers used it for entertainment. The fourth Mughal emperor would order mass crushings when bored. An elephant weighs 5 to 6 tons. When that weight focuses on a human limb, bones don't just break, they're pulverized into fragments. Internal organs rupture. The skull, when finally crushed, would explode like a watermelon. The theatrical aspect mattered. Elephants could be trained to crush slowly or quickly, to step on specific body parts, or even to use tusks for piercing. The control demonstrated the ruler's power, not just to kill, but to choreograph death itself. Historical accounts describe elephants being trained from a young age, specifically for executions. They would learn to place their feet precisely, to apply gradual pressure, and to respond to handler commands for speed and force. Some elephants became famous for their execution work, developing reputations that added to the terror. Sawing in half came in 2 varieties, horizontal and vertical. Horizontal was quicker, saw through the waist. The victim dies relatively fast from blood loss and organ damage. Verticals took longer. For vertical sawing, victims were hung upside down, legs spread, and sawed from the groin upward. Being inverted kept blood in the brain, preventing unconsciousness from blood loss. Victims would remain conscious even as the saw reached chest level, feeling every stroke, watching their own bodies being divided. Roman Emperor Caligula reportedly watched sawing during meals. Medieval Europe used it sporadically. The cruelty was in the slowness. Each saw stroke took time, creating a rhythm of agony. The saw would cut through skin, fat, muscle, and eventually bone. Modern experiments with cadavers suggest that sawing through a human body vertically would take 15–30 minutes, depending on the saw's sharpness and the sawyer's strength. That's 15 to 30 minutes of consciousness while being cut in half. Some accounts describe 2-person saws being used, with executioners working in rhythm. Others mention weights being added to the saw blade to help it bite through tissue. The technical details suggest this wasn't random violence, but carefully considered execution methodology. Lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, was a Chinese execution practice from 900 CE to 1905. The torturer would make precise, shallow cuts all over the body, sometimes following a predetermined pattern. Some versions involved removing pieces of flesh systematically. The art was in prolonging death, cut deep enough to cause pain and bleeding, but not deep enough to sever major arteries. Some executions lasted hours. Photographs from the early 1900s show victims still conscious after extensive cutting, faces twisted in agony. The final cut, a stab to the heart, would end it, but by then, the victim had endured dozens or hundreds of individual wounds, each one adding to the cumulative agony. One documented case from 1904 shows a criminal named Wang Weiqin who underwent lingqi for killing his parents. Photographs show him bound to a post with visible cuts across his entire body. body. Observers reported he remained conscious throughout most of the process, which took over an hour. The number 1,000 was often metaphorical. Actual cuts ranged from dozens to a few hundred, but the principle remained: maximum pain over maximum time, with death delayed as long as possible. These methods represent humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty. They weren't random violence. They were engineered systems, refined over centuries, designed for specific purposes. Some extracted confessions, some deterred crime, some demonstrated power, some satisfied sadistic rulers. But they all shared one quality: they understood human biology and psychology intimately and exploited that understanding to maximize suffering. The rack targeted joint mechanics. Scaphism weaponized natural decay. Impalement used gravity as torture. The oubliette exploited our fear of isolation and darkness. We've abolished most of these practices. The last public guillotining happened in 1977. The last keel hauling was in 1882. Boiling was outlawed in the 1540s. Progress exists, however slowly, yet some methods persist. Crucifixion still occurs in certain countries. Stoning continues. Beheading remains legal in some jurisdictions. The instruments change. Bullets replace swords. Lethal injection replaces boiling, but the state's power to inflict death continues. Understanding this history matters not for shock value, but because it reveals truths about power, justice, and human nature. These punishments existed in civilized societies with art, literature, and philosophy. They weren't aberrations by monsters. They were official state policy, often with public support. That's perhaps the most disturbing realization. These weren't hidden atrocities. They were public entertainment. Families attended. Vendors sold souvenirs. Crowds cheered. The cruelty was the point, openly celebrated. We'd like to believe we've evolved beyond such barbarity, but the psychology that made these punishments effective, fear, deterrence, spectacle, dehumanization, hasn't disappeared. It's just found new forms. If you enjoyed this video, click on any of the other videos showing on your screen for more.